My name is Bo Jacobs. I'm a historian, an American historian of nuclear technologies. I study cultural and social aspects of nuclear technologies. I've looked at nuclear representation in popular culture, nuclear cultural narrative, but especially in the last few years, I've been working with a colleague in Australia on a project called the Global Hibakusha Project. Hibakusha is a Japanese word. It's probably a good place to start a course studying the nuclear Pacific. Hibakusha is a Japanese word that was invented after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were attacked with nuclear weapons. It literally means explosion-affected person, but it is the shorthand word for a survivor of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've been working on a project called the Global Hibakusha Project with a colleague of mine from Australia, Dr. Mick Broderick, where we've been looking at people affected by radiation and nuclear technology all around the world. So I want to talk a little bit to start us off today about Japan and the nuclear history of Japan. Japan is unfortunately at the bookends of our history of the nuclear modern era and nuclear technologies, both the most recent and the first awareness that we have of the problems of nuclear technologies come through Japan. One thing I just want to point out is that this map up here, this is a map showing the movement of radionuclides in the upper atmosphere from nuclear testing. The word Hibakusha means a survivor of a nuclear explosion. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki were attacked, there have been over 2,000 nuclear tests in the world. Lots of those nuclear tests had fireballs that went up into the upper atmosphere and deposited radioactive fallout that circled the world and came down all around the world, no matter how far from a nuclear test site you were. And this is a map that shows the movements through the upper atmosphere, and the hot spots show the nuclear test sites. There have been nuclear weapons tested on every continent except South America and Antarctica. Everyone in the world found out together, really, that nuclear weapons exist. Before August 1945, a few thousand people knew that there were nuclear weapons. On August 6th, the whole world learned together that these weapons existed. Maybe one of the first instances we have of an important historical event that was largely experienced simultaneously by most people with access to any kind of media. They learned about the nuclear attack on Hiroshima on August 6th and the nuclear attack on Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9th. This is the way that most of us first encountered nuclear weapons. Of course, most of us weren't born yet, but human beings encountered nuclear weapons with these photographs of clouds taken from airplanes that had dropped these weapons. Nuclear weapons are different than other weapons in a lot of ways. We measure their force the same way we measure other weapons, but they have some unique characteristics. Here, this map on the right here is the typical map that we show people in Hiroshima of the destruction of the nuclear attack on Hiroshima. Right up here, so you see the red spot there shows where the blast and the heat of the weapon about 3 kilometers out from ground zero affected. But here on the right is a different map. This is a map that shows what was called black rain. After a nuclear explosion, the nuclear cloud goes up into the upper atmosphere and it draws a lot of material from the ground up into that fireball. A lot of that material will then fall back down to Earth, sometimes far away from where the nuclear weapon was exploded. In Hiroshima, there was a large area where radioactive fallout came down to the northwest. This area, heavy rain area and light rain area. It was called black rain because the particulates inside the rain gave it color and made it clearly different than regular rain. This rain was bringing down alpha-emitting particles, which are molecules that become ionized and become radioactive. There's a burst when the weapon first went off, a burst about the size of gamma radiation, about the size of that red splotch there. So all the people that were in the middle of the city were affected by the blast of the weapon and the heat of the weapon and a burst of radiation. But then there's a secondary amount of radiation, the fallout, the residual radiation, which goes up into the cloud and comes down a little bit further away. And we've had trouble since 1945 in accounting for people that are affected by this kind of radioactive fallout. So we tend to leave it out. We tend not to think about people being affected by having alpha-emitting particles spread around an area, but we tend to think of people being irradiated by gamma radiation burst from a bomb. So the word Hibakusha was coined for people who were affected by the weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even till today, many of the people who suffered illness from having encountered black rain are not technically considered Hibakusha in Japan. We don't extend that category to people who experienced the fallout, just the people who experienced the explosion. So this is a contentious point in Hiroshima, but it's a separation between different people who get categorized as exposed to radiation, either from being close to a radioactive source or from being exposed to fallout later. These fall into different categories, and I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of Fukushima. So as you can see here, a nuclear weapon mushroom cloud will draw lots of material up into the upper atmosphere, and then that cloud in the upper atmosphere may blow downwind and deposit that radiation downwind. If it goes high enough up into the upper atmosphere, it's not necessarily even going to go downwind. It could disperse all around. The United States did tests in the 1950s and determined that fallout radiation from nuclear weapons were being encountered by human beings and living creatures as far south as the bottom of South America. It doesn't matter how close to a nuclear test site you are. So the Japanese encountered both the blast and the heat of that weapon and also the fallout. I'm just going to run through one or two quick things and then focus on Fukushima. In 1954, the United States tested its first deliverable hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bombs are thousands of times more powerful than atomic bombs. They're H-bombs is what we often call them in popular culture, A-bombs and H-bombs. There's a lot of differences to them, but one of the things that I want to point out is that this is one of the places where humans figured out that radioactive fallout was something that had to be considered separately from just nuclear weapon detonations. This is a fallout cloud from the first H-bomb test, the Bravo test. And one of the things that I will point out is that right at about 100 miles from ground zero, there was a Japanese fishing boat called the Daigo Fukuyu Maru, the Lucky Dragon fishing boat. There were other fishing boats in this area too. They were outside of the area that the US said they were not allowed to be in. But this was a Japanese fishing boat. 3 hours after the Bravo nuclear weapon test, ash began to fall on this boat, ash about 3 inches thick. When the boat got back to port a couple weeks later, the entire crew of 23 fishermen had to be hospitalized from radiation sickness. And one of the fishermen died a few months later from radiation sickness. So these people were 100 miles away from where the bomb was detonated. They had no sensation of blast or heat or any of the effects of the weapon. But still, 3 hours later, ash could fall on them that was radioactive and dangerous enough that it could kill them. So for the Japanese, they were attacked with nuclear weapons in Hiroshima, and they were attacked by nuclear weapons in Nagasaki. And regardless of what you think about World War II or the various other aspects of it, you have nuclear attacks on Japan in 1945. When the first H-bombs are tested in 1954, again, you have Japanese casualty. You have a Japanese casualty. So the Japanese frequently think that they have been special victims of atomic technologies, of nuclear weaponry. First by being attacked, and second, even when there was nuclear testing, Japanese national citizens end up being killed by nuclear weapons. So the Japanese have this sense of a strange relationship with these weapons and with these exposures to fallout, which provides a framework, in a sense, that the Fukushima incident can fit into. Because the Fukushima incident is part of a continuum for the Japanese people of exposure to radiation, of being, in a sense, strangely signaled out by history to have encounters with nuclear technology. It's very much the way that a lot of people do see it, so it wasn't so shocking. partly what was shocking for the Japanese and what differentiates what happened in Fukushima from what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that it was always easy to talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki having been done to the Japanese by the Americans. So there was a sense of blamelessness, even though there's clearly issues about Japanese aggression in World War II, Japanese war crimes that were committed in other countries, and ways in which the Japanese brought the attacks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki on themselves through their own international aggression in World War II. But beyond that, Fukushima is an incident in which the spreading of radiation around an area of Japan, the exposure of a group of people to radiation was not done by a foreign enemy, but instead was done by Japan to itself. So it's caused a lot of soul searching in Japan in ways that the earlier encounters with nuclear weaponry technologies never did. So it's a very complicated issue for people in Japan. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how radiation exposures change communities and how that's happened in Fukushima. In Fukushima, you have some of the things that I was just talking about sort of all brought together in strange relief. Over here on the left, you have a map showing the radiation in Japan. And this map to me is a very incongruous map. There are several different things going on in this map that don't fit together, but they're not explained when this map is shown. The first thing that you see on this map is concentric circles. Concentric circles are usually what you see when you see the area of damage from a nuclear weapon. The area of damage will go out from a center, from ground zero, and the damage will get less as you go further away. So at the center of those concentric circles is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants. So those concentric circles are about getting away from the nuclear power plants themselves. And just to give everyone a little background, in 2011, on March 11th, there was a giant earthquake in northern Japan, a 9-point earthquake that resulted in a massive tsunami that came ashore along that coast there. After the earthquake happened at a nuclear site, Fukushima Daiichi, Fukushima number 1, there's also a separate location, Fukushima number 2. There were 6 nuclear power plants at Fukushima Daiichi, and 3 of those nuclear power plants experienced full meltdowns after the earthquake and the tsunami, and another one had an explosion and fire where the spent fuel was stored. So you had 4 nuclear power plants that are completely blacked out with no electricity and no cooling to the nuclear fuel in the core of the nuclear power plants. So eventually you have 3 complete meltdowns and an explosion. So it's this massive release of radiation during the meltdowns and a massive release of radiation during the explosions. The situation currently is that it will take many, many, many decades to begin the cleanup of the Fukushima plant. The cores of 3 of the reactors have melted, in some cases we believe outside of the buildings, just into the ground underneath the building. Nobody can approach these cores at all. They're too radioactive. Once somebody got within the same room as that core, they would be dead within a matter of minutes from the levels of radiation. We're not even able to bring robots close to the core because the robots stop functioning because of the high levels of radiation. So it'll take us several decades to be able to begin to contain and remove these melted cores. One of the most tragic aspects of where this happened is that it's in an area where there's a tremendous movement of groundwater through that area. So you have a lot of water essentially coming into contact with this melted core and coming into contact with all of the parts of the reactor buildings that were highly contaminated and just moving out to sea every day. You have groundwater moving through, getting contaminated and moving out to sea. And there's really no way to stop that. There are ways to make it a little less severe by channeling the water around the core so that less water comes into contact with the radioactive material. There have been some other attempted ways to block the water. for example, putting in an ice wall to block the water to go around it. But ultimately, when you have a tremendous amount of water moving through an area, it's pretty much impossible to stop that and to just make it go somewhere else. So we'll have water encountering this corium, this melted core, and coming into the sea for decades. We're just now building a new containment around the melted core of the Chernobyl reactor. It's almost 30 years later. We're still working on containing Chernobyl. As some people say, we know when nuclear events start, but we never know when nuclear events finish, because they never do quite finish. They go on for quite a while. So what you have here in this map is you have concentric circles coming out from where the nuclear power plant is. There's a lot of gamma radiation, a lot of radiation coming off of those plants. People can't get near the cores. So people have been evacuated. People who live close to it have been evacuated from nearby. Eventually, the mandatory evacuations went to 20 kilometers. Suggested, advised evacuations went out to 30 kilometers. What's the difference between a mandatory evacuation and a suggested evacuation? The only difference is who pays. So the area of mandatory evacuation has been kept very, very small so that the liability of the government is kept small. But other people are told it's probably smart if you move, but nobody's going to help pay for that. So you're on your own with that. So this is the difference between mandatory and suggested evacuation. The idea of concentric circles is that you have to get away from something. You have to get away from a point source of radiation. But the other thing that you see is this big splotchy color coming off to the side that's very irregular, that is not perfectly circular. This is where the clouds came down from the explosions when the reactor buildings exploded. Each time that one of these ones exploded, a tremendous amount of radionuclides, of radioactive particles, is brought up into the air, and because it's not a big nuclear explosion, but it's at ground level, it doesn't go into the upper atmosphere. So it comes up into the air and basically comes down in the nearby downwind. And as you can see, most of this material came down to the northwest from the plants. Some of it came down to the southwest. These plumes deposited really irregular amounts of radioactive particles all across this area. Many of them are in the form of alpha-emitting particles, which is small particles that are radioactive, but they're not highly radioactive the way that the core is. So alpha-emitting particles, for example, can't pass through paper. They can't pass through skin. But if you internalize alpha particles, if you inhale them, if you swallow them, if you get them through cuts in the skin, then they can lodge inside the body, and one particle that doesn't give off very much radiation will give off this radiation to the cells around it 24 hours a day for the rest of your life. So moving away from a point source, from the big gamma radiation, the really large radioactive molten core, is very, very important. But a second thing happened in Fukushima, which was that these clouds deposited radiation all across this area to the northwest. Some of the areas outside of the mandatory evacuation zones are much higher in radiation than some of the areas inside the mandatory evacuation zones. So the radiation is spread very irregularly. As a result, it's extremely hard to live with, extremely hard to do anything about. I mentioned to you before that because black rain was hard to understand, because alpha-emitting particles are very irregular, scientists tend to leave those out when talking about the impacts of radiation on health. So you have here an area with lots of radiation spread around farmland, cities, mountain areas, hillsides, spread all across this large area, and it's very irregular. So what do you do about that? There's a lot of different options about what you do about that. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who live in the Fukushima area are simply having to deal with that. One of the first things that happens is that the government and industry says that they will come in and decontaminate, remove the radiation. Now, a lot of these radionuclides, a lot of these radioactive particles will be radioactive for tens of thousands of years, some of them for millions of years. So how do you remove something that stays what it is for a million years? How do you remove something that is dangerous for tens of thousands of years? You can't. All you can do is move it around or contain it. That's all you can try and do. Such large areas were contaminated with radiation in Japan, in Fukushima prefecture, and a few other prefectures nearby, that it's really spread all over mountainsides, hillsides, and it's very, very difficult to do anything about it. What the government is doing is paying people to essentially bag it up with equipment, put it into bags, and then these bags are taken and buried in hillsides. Now, as you can see here, it doesn't take long for living things to find its way outside of plastic. These radionuclides are radioactive for tens of thousands of years. Many of them have made their way into this plant. They've been taken up into the plant. Wherever these bags go, eventually this plastic will decay, those plants will grow, those plants will decay. The radionuclides will just keep moving through the ecosystem. It'll just keep moving through the plants, it'll move along with water. So you can't decontaminate it. You can't make it not radioactive. You can simply try to control where it goes. But the ways that we're trying to control where it goes are very, very immediate and low-tech, quick ways to solve a problem, trying to scrape off topsoil and saying that now it's not radioactive, where there's no place to put that topsoil except over in some other soil, where eventually it'll come out of these bags of containment. So essentially there's really no way to decontaminate. And the government of Japan and the nuclear industry, they know this. There's a history to this. All kinds of places have been made radioactive, and we've tried to decontaminate them. Lots and lots of places around the world have become contaminated with radiation, and we've put a lot of money into decontaminating them. And we know that you cannot decontaminate. You cannot decontaminate things. You cannot decontaminate hillsides. You cannot decontaminate nature. But as always, when a nuclear incident happens, especially when we're not talking about the military, but when we're talking about the nuclear power industry, government, and the nuclear and the supporting groups of nuclear industry, almost always the way that the industry and government respond to disaster is that the first and most important thing that has to be done is that public reaction has to be controlled. So before public safety is protected, the first thing we do is we try to make sure people don't panic, because that's seen as the worst thing that can happen, is people panicking. So we try to control perceptions about how dangerous it is. Well, I shouldn't say we try to. In the period of crisis after 3/11, the government of Japan and TEPCO very much tried to control perceptions of the situation in order to make people believe that it was not nearly as dangerous as it was. TEPCO, the power company that ran the reactors, for 3 months lied outrightly that there were meltdowns at these reactors. They said there were no meltdowns at these reactors. This was at a period of time when it was obvious to anybody with any kind of advanced physics training, just from news reports, it was obvious that there were meltdowns at these nuclear power plants within 3 days or 4 days. It was undeniable that there were meltdowns at these power plants. Yet, the nuclear industry maintained for 3 months that there were no meltdowns at these power plants. So during that week, when your headlines here in Seattle were full of Fukushima every day in March of 2011, at no point did it say meltdown. It says possible meltdown, feared meltdown. 3 months later, when TEPCO admits that there were 3 meltdowns, that story is on page 20 of the paper, because Fukushima is not a front page story anymore. That is considered success. That is success in managing this event, because managing public perceptions is generally seems to be more important than managing public health. Here you don't see a commitment to managing public health, just to managing perceptions. Here's the idea that, oh, we can remove all of this radiation. Even though it's clearly not true, people are told this repeatedly because it helps them to calm down and to feel like there is no problem here. A lot of the people that are evacuated, that are forcibly evacuated, have been put into what's called temporary housing. Invariably, people who are moved from contaminated radioactive places to temporary housing, the temporary housing always is permanent housing. It's never temporary housing. Because, again, with the people in Fukushima, the government of Japan has been telling a lot of people since March 2011 that they will be returning to their homes. This is true for a lot of people that we know will not be returning to their homes. Their homes are in areas that are too close to the old reactors, that are too highly radioactive, really, for anybody to be living there anytime soon. Instead of telling people that, the government of Japan has been telling people living in these evacuation centers that hopefully you can move back home next year, maybe in a year and a half, maybe in 2 years. They were supposed to be back by now originally. It's uncertain, of course, when any of them will be returning. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of things that break down when you begin to take apart communities because of exposures to radiation. There have been a number of places because of nuclear testing and nuclear production where people have been removed from living near nuclear sites, like near Chernobyl, near certain of the nuclear test sites. And invariably, when you move people away from where their homes are and where their community is located, you begin to get a social breakdown that is separate from any kind of illness or any kind of sickness that's caused by radiation. Imagine, for example, people who have been removed from their houses, traditional houses that they may have lived in for generations. One of the things that comes along with this kind of social structure is the ability for multi-generational family caregiving. You have grandparents, great-grandparents that can live with their family because you have a variety of caregivers in the family who can take care of grandparents, who can take care of great-grandparents in their old age, and can help keep them healthy. You have childcare available for parents from those grandparents, from aunts and uncles, from an extended family unit. You have the ability of a family to support itself in a really dynamic way. When you take all of those generations and you take all of those pieces of that family and you move them all into separate little huts, separate little housing places, often not nearby each other, outside of people not living in their home, you begin to break down a lot of support structure within the community. You don't have people living where all of the neighbors know who everybody is, people watch out for everybody, all of the adults in the neighborhood know which families children belong to and keep an eye out. You begin to have the fragmentation of modern living. You also have people who have been taken out of really traditional lifestyle jobs, for example, farming and fishing, that may have gone on for generations. And suddenly people are now living on government handouts in small prefab apartments and looking for jobs in the service industry in the suburbs of Tokyo. So you have a culture that's been intact for hundreds and hundreds of years that begins to break down too as the community is abandoned. One of the other things that comes along with this is the sort of normalization of living in a toxic environment. We've all had to manage that to some extent, living in the modern world, living with toxic chemistry and living with some of the consequences of modern lifestyle. Here in the upper corner there you have school children. This is a permanently installed Geiger counter at their schoolyard showing what the radiation levels are out in the field by their school. Down below them you have some school children showing off their dosimeters. These are badges that school children wear in certain areas of northern Japan to gather information about their radiation exposures. This is just gamma radiation exposure, so it's not all of their radiation exposure. And the important thing to realize about this is that those dosimeters that those school children are wearing do not give them any information about the dangers around them. So there's no indicator from those dosimeters if there's someplace that's highly radioactive, that's dangerous to them. They don't know that. These dosimeters are simply gathering information about their exposures so they can be totaled by healthcare providers later. So this is just making a record of their radiation exposure. It's not in any way protecting them or giving them tools to protect themselves from radiation exposure. But this is normal life for children in certain parts of northern Japan now, is to wear a dosimeter at all times. It's normal. Living in a toxic environment, keeping records of your toxic exposures, this is normal childhood now. But for me, one of the most devastating is images like this. You have lots of schools in the area where it's too radioactive in the areas just outside of the school for the children to play outside. So you have a lot of parts of Fukushima Prefecture where children are restricted to 10 or 15 minutes outdoors, walking to school and walking home, or possibly going out to play in a very contained area for 10 minutes. So instead, there's all kinds of efforts made to give children physical stimulation and activity indoors. So even sandboxes are now indoors in some parts of northern Japan. You have those kind of jumpy inflatable ball buildings that kids love. They have those in schools now, so kids can jump around a little bit. One of the things that comes along with that, though, is when there's a radiation exposure in a community like there was in northern Japan, and when there isn't any leadership coming from the political structures, you have a community that is, in essence, left to fight with itself. You have, for example, some schools in Fukushima, to support local farmers, have decided to serve milk from local farms in the schools in Fukushima to the students every day. Well, some parents don't want their children drinking local milk, and they're working hard to get food sourced from other places for their children. So now you have a couple parents that are in a position of having to say, I don't want my child to participate in drinking school milk. Instead, I will provide an alternative milk for my child to drink. So what you have is 2 or 3 children who are now not drinking the local milk, which may or may not be contaminated. What you have is a division, though, beginning to be created among those children of which children have the parents that make trouble, which children have the parents that don't believe what the principal says. And there's a lot of conflict between families and between children and even between adults. Over here you see that Geiger counter reading. Well, one of the things about alpha-emitting particles, when you have an explosion dropping fallout, is that it's very, very, very unevenly distributed. So you can easily go find parents with Geiger counters 2 feet away from this Geiger counter showing a completely different reading. And both readings are accurate. It's unevenly distributed. That's part of the idea, is that that reading that you see there doesn't mean that that's the reading for this entire field. But we're allowed to have that fallacy. We're allowed to believe that. Nobody will clarify for us that this is just telling us what it is at a certain spot right there in that field, at a certain height. This is one of the ways that government and industry try to not quite tell us the truth while not exactly lying. Sometimes they lied about the meltdowns. Is that it's possible, for example, to decontaminate, if this room had been highly contaminated with alpha-emitting particles, it's possible to decontaminate this room so that I could stand here with a Geiger counter held maybe 4 feet up off the ground and show you a reading that says that it's perfectly safe to be in this room. But I could then take that Geiger counter to the corners of the room and other parts of the room and show much higher readings. And that's not at all unusual with alpha-emitting particles, the kind of contamination that they're facing in northern Japan. This kind of radiation tends to follow channels in the ecosystem, wind and water, and concentrates where water concentrates, and along channels where wind blows. So this is one of the reasons that people are very concerned about this situation specifically, is that these children are living in a very contaminated place. Children are much more impacted by exposure to radiation because they're smaller and growing fast. Because their bodies are growing quickly, their cells are dividing rapidly, any problems that they have from exposures to radiation manifest much more quickly than it does if an adult were to have that same exposure. So it's much more dangerous for children to be exposed to radiation than it is for adults. And children, as we know, are closer to the ground, tend to put things in their mouth, and are really going to become contaminated with radiation when they're in a radioactive environment much quicker than adults are. But this is part of the new normal, is that there's tens of thousands of children living without playing outdoors. But anyways, one of the things I was going to say, you have a mother standing taking a reading right near this, this Geiger counter, and then you have several other parents from the neighborhood telling that person to stop walking around the neighborhood taking readings with Geiger counters everywhere, because it's just upsetting everybody, and it's upsetting the children. So you have a lot of conflict going on inside the community between people who want to believe what the government says, people who want to believe what experts say, and other people who want to take charge of this information themselves. And it ends up creating conflict in the communities. One of the things that's really, that I think is really important when there's radioactive contamination in a community is that it just creates divisions among people. One of the main divisions is contaminated people and people that are normal. This, for this child, is the beginning of a lifetime of being studied, of being watched, of having people take samples, medical samples. Even people who have left Fukushima and have moved to other parts of Japan, there's all kinds of stories of bullying of children, school children that have moved to other prefectures from Fukushima, cars with Fukushima license plates getting vandalized in other places, people hiding if they were from Fukushima. Many of the things that the Hibakusha in Hiroshima and Nagasaki discovered 70 years ago, such as people don't want to marry people who come from someplace that had radioactive contamination because they fear that these people will have more birth defects with children, more difficulty having children. People don't want to give jobs to people who they think may have been exposed to radiation because they think that the person will become sick more often, will have less energy, will be more of a burden. So there's all kinds of discrimination that follows not just radiation exposure, but perception of radiation exposure, the belief that people have been exposed to radiation. And what follows along with that is a tremendous amount of being treated as though you're not a normal member of society, being treated as though you have a different status. And the uncertainty that people have about whether or not they're exposed to radiation or not just feeds this anxiety for the rest of their lives. I want to talk about one more thing about Fukushima before I tell you a little tale at the end. One of the things that's most difficult to talk about in this kind of a crisis is the spiritual disruptions that happen. These are the things that are really, really not easy to see. It's easy to see when people get sick. It's easy to see when people's businesses close, but it's not easy to see when people have something inside of them that's disconnected. The story that I'll tell you about Fukushima, to help you understand, is about the Japanese holiday of Obon. Obon is a holiday in August in many parts of Asia. In Japan, it's in August, and it's a time when people go to the village where their family is from and take care and maintain and honor the graves and memories of their ancestors. So people all over Japan go to the village where their family was originally from. The family gathers in the original home, and the people go and clean the graves of the relatives in the local graveyard where the relatives are born. They sing songs to honor the spirits and the memories of the ancestors. And then at the end of Obon, they sing songs to accompany the spirits of the ancestors back to their graves, and that's the yearly ritual. Well, for a lot of people who live near the Fukushima Daiichi plant, they cannot do that now. They can't go maintain the graves of their ancestors because these graves are in places that are too radioactive. So what happens to somebody who breaks that chain? You have a chain maybe for 10, 20 generations of descendants caretaking the graves of their ancestors and maintaining this memory of their ancestors. In all kinds of societies, it's believed that we succeed in walking this world because we're walking in the world that the ancestors built. When you're no longer able to connect to the ancestors and meet your obligations of honoring and remembering them, bad things will follow. And so for a lot of people who are unable to maintain these rituals, even though they know, I didn't do anything wrong, the nuclear plants blew up, I've been moved forcibly, I can't go back there for Obon. People know that at first, but a lot of the people that I talk to experienced radiation exposures 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And when people have spent their whole life failing to live up to obligations placed on them through tradition, through ritual, and through membership in a community, people begin to feel really, really like they failed, even if they know it was not their fault. There's a way in which the bonds that we have to our own identity, to our family, to our community, when these things become frayed and ruptured because of the nature of the technological world that we live in and the nature of the toxic world that we live in, we don't yet have very good skills at regaining our center once we've lost our connection to our community and to our ancestors and our past. And that will remain a challenge for us. One of the things that I just want to look at in closing, I want to tell you an interesting story that came to me in my research as a historian. And that's one strange thing that I noticed after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is slightly disconnected from the talk about Fukushima, but mostly connected to that point at the end. One of the things I noticed when I was doing research about representations of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks in the United States, in newspapers and magazines in 1945, I was gathering lots and lots of articles, lots and lots of material, and I started to notice an unusual thing in some of the editorial cartoons, so I started to collect them. And over a few years I found that it was fairly amazing, and what that was to me was that there was this representation of the Earth in the week of the bombings, the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in August of 1945 and September of 1945 and October, that just seemed really out of place, and I'll show you some of these cartoons. All of these are from August to December 1945 in either American or British newspapers. This one from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So here you have the atomic bomb, which is as big as the world. And the Earth is sitting there, the atomic bomb looks mad, the Earth is looking at it and saying, well, like, what are you going to do? So what's interesting to me here is that the Earth is depicted as a head, just a big head, one creature, confronted by the atomic bomb. Now here you have science holding the future of civilization in its hand. So again, you see the world is a world that is got a grid on it. It's the whole world, and the future of the entire world has the same fate. Future threat of war, the violence which is threatening the world, and the control of atomic power will stop the violence. So again, you have the whole world being threatened by war and violence. Atomic power attacking the Earth. There's the Earth down there with a nice grid. And finally, the Earth once again as a head, as a human being, just a single human being faced with this decision, violence or order. So the entire world is entering the atomic age, and the entire world will experience either violence or order. Well, the reason I got very interested in these images was that they kept showing in a sense what I've tended to call target Earth. The notion that in a nuclear war, the victim of a nuclear war is the Earth itself. Well, in a lot of those cartoons was something that was really recognizable to me in the way that the Earth was being portrayed, but a way that we came to frame for ourselves much later than 1945, and that's the idea of the whole Earth. The whole Earth photographed from space was first released into our culture in the mid-1960s, once we got off the planet. Once we got off the planet and we looked back at the Earth, what we saw were some unusual things that we didn't quite expect. It reframed our relationship to the Earth. The main thing is that when you look at the Earth from space, what's immediately missing from earlier visions of the Earth is the lines between the countries. When you look at a globe from an earlier period of time, that's the dominant feature of an Earth, is the lines between the countries. But when you actually go into space and you look back, they're not there. So they're created by human beings. They're not natural, and they're maybe not real, or only as real as we make them. So you don't see those lines at all. You also start to get a sense of the Earth as a really fragile place in the immense darkness of space. This delicate, tender blue ball of life, with all of the life and everything we know on it, surrounded by endless, cold, empty space. So the life that we have here is very, very fragile. And one of the other things that the whole Earth says to us, one of the main messages that it has, is that the people of the Earth have one common destiny. Either the people of the Earth we're all going to live, or we're all going to die. Our individual destinies are specific to us, but one of the things that we realized with nuclear weaponry and the threat of nuclear war was that either we were going to have this war where the victim would be the Earth, and that means all of us, or we weren't going to have it. And so our destinies were tied up together. It doesn't matter if you lived in Russia, it doesn't matter if you lived in Japan, it doesn't matter if you lived in Brazil, it doesn't matter if you lived in the United States. If we have a thermonuclear war, if we have a big nuclear war, everybody loses. So we've reached a point technologically where the problems are of a scale where the only way we can respond to them is collectively as a planet. One of the two main topics in this class, nuclear issues and climate change. These are the first two places where humans have been confronted with this notion that problems that we face can only be solved by people of the world solving them collectively rather than individually as nations. The United States could pass any laws it wants about climate change tomorrow, but if the rest of the world doesn't cooperate, it doesn't really matter what we do by ourselves. And when this first happened, that conflict was really first understood, I think, in 1945 because of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those editorial cartoonists that were drawing those editorial cartoons in which the Earth was one single being with one destiny and not a differentiation between people who believed in communism and people who believed in capitalism and people who believed in all kinds of different things. This was the point in 1945 when the technology had reached the scale where we had to begin to respond to it, not as people who lived in a nation, but rather as people who lived on a planet, people who lived on a globe. And that's, I think, one of the things that to me is one of the most fascinating things is that even in August of 1945, even in the midst of being confronted with that kind of technology, learning about the Holocaust, the nature of the Holocaust, one of the things that grew out of our reorientation towards our problems at this period of time was an understanding of ourselves as global citizens. And it's clear to me that the more we move towards an idea of global citizenship and away from an idea of national citizenship, the closer we get to being the kind of people who can think about these problems and solve these problems. So I'm encouraged that at this unbelievably dark point in which human beings used nuclear weapons to attack other human beings and the environment all around Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at that moment of deep, dark threat, there was born this vision of what we are as people, a new vision of what we are as people. And it's amazing to me that in the 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, that this symbol became one of the most recognizable symbols around the world. You know, young children living in almost any country could tell you what that is and tell you a little bit about that. That's a tremendously inspiring thing to me. Because we're confronted by nuclear weapons, we're confronted by nuclear power plant meltdowns, we're confronted by climate change, we're confronted by all of these things. It's very easy to see the ways in which we fail to meet the challenges of our time. And it's a lot more difficult to see the ways in which we're perfectly positioned to meet the challenges of our times. There are ways in which students in this class have tools and capacities available to them that could only have been dreamt of decades ago, which is great because you will need all of those things to go into the future that we've built for ourselves. So in closing, I want to just share with you, because the work that I work on is, and I think it's true that a lot of the people you'll hear speaking in this class for the next semester, a lot of this content is fairly dark. It's about human beings suffering and human beings that have done terrible things to other people. So it's, when you grapple with difficult global politics, it's always important to have some places where you understand why what you do is valuable. And this has always been really useful for me, so I wanted to share it with you. But it's a quote from Doris Lessing, probably, I think, one of the finest writers, just recently died in her 90s, Nobel Prize winning novelist. But she said that when she was young, she just recently died in her 90s. So when she was young, meaning the 20s and the 30s, all of the things that seemed terrifying to her and so big politically that there was no way little Doris Lessing, could do anything about them, all of those things that scared her so much when she was young, now that she was an old woman, they're all gone. And what she specifically meant was the British Empire, Stalin's Russia, which seemed like giant, brutal things that there was nothing anybody could do anything about. But she says that in her old age, in her 80s and her 90s, these things are just gone. And that's the way that it is in history. In history, everything will pass. Nothing will stay forever. So, when you work for climate change, when you work against nuclear weapons, when you work for these difficult kinds of causes, always remember that it will lose. It will eventually pass from this world. And so remember, every day, the little things you do when you get up, the little things you do to work to make this world a better place are how that ends up happening. So you should always have faith in the work that you do. It's very hard to see the impact of the work that you do, especially when what you're doing is caring about the planet, caring about people. But without it, we would never get anywhere. So always bear in mind that everything that you're doing really is having an impact. Anyways, should we stop for a little bit, or a couple questions now?
Yeah, we can take, well, thank you.
Oh. Thanks a lot. It's really a challenge. I mean, it's heartbreaking. People adapt, but whether they suffer inappropriately is hard to say. People will make decent lives for themselves as much as they can in almost any situation. So they'll be okay, but there will be all of this loss of the things that just get tossed aside when communities get abandoned. And so there will be no, who knows what the loss is for grandchildren to not grow up with their grandparents in the house or nearby or a part of their daily lives. It's hard to say. So they'll come through it. And people are incredibly resilient and resourceful, and we tend to rebuild our spiritual wholeness around what we have available to us no matter what. It's a survival instinct. So I think it's really wonderful to know that it's really hard to keep people down, but that doesn't mean that they're not being treated badly and that all kinds of things couldn't be done for them. One of the things from my point of view, for example, there was all kinds of misinformation when this event happened about the radiation levels around the plant and nearby. There was a lot of anxiety about this. Well, one of the ways that people have dealt with this is that citizens have created a complete Geiger counter radiation monitoring infrastructure in Japan now. So there are now Geiger counters. This is all by crowdsourcing. There are now Geiger counters all across Japan that you can pull out a smartphone in real time and look and get radiation readings, throughout the entire country. So it will be impossible in the future for the government to lie about the radiation levels during an event and for people not to have their own information. So there's ways in which people have empowered themselves and that's evidence of spiritual wholeness, taking control of the situation, feeling empowered. But it's an adaptation. It's a really good adaptation to see people seizing control of the things that affect their lives. But it's a reaction to being lied to. So, for many of us, I think if you come from a farm community in Fukushima and your ancestors have been farmers for 10 generations, it's hard for me to know exactly what gets lost and what doesn't. I come from a culture like most of us here in America where we're very transitory. We don't have connections to where our ancestors are buried at all. We don't have a sense of our lives as growing out of them in the same way that lots of people do in lots of different countries. So in a sense, we've made that adjustment as a nation in a lot of ways to be disconnected from our past. So humans survive. But there's no doubt that even though humans are adaptable and humans do survive, being treated that way, being treated that it's okay if your land is contaminated and if you don't know if your children are safe and nobody's going to do anything to help, and probably you should stop complaining and whining because it means you think crazy things and read crazy internet things. This sort of treatment can be really brutal for people, and it can leave really deep scars. Yeah, that's a good question. In the immediate period, demand was reduced dramatically. I think it was over 30%, over 30 to 40%. But then we were told not to conserve. And the reason was because the use of electricity dropped to such a low level in Japan that all of the power companies were losing money. So the government wanted to support the energy consumption so that these companies would be viable. So they told us to stop conserving power. That was in the immediate few months. It's now 3.5 years. The majority of the energy that it's replaced with is natural gas and coal, but the conservation remains at 30% or so. So that's, from my point of view, this is a period where Japan needed to move very quickly towards renewable resources. Because if you believe human civilization will exist on Earth for thousands of years, there's no way that can happen on finite fuels. So if we are going to live here indefinitely in an industrial world, it can only be done with renewables. And so the quicker we move towards that, the better. This was a real opportunity for Japan to take a leading role in developing these technologies, but instead the Japanese government chose to essentially prop up the economy of an outdated system, which is what we're doing. It's certainly the case, although I think that when it comes to moving across the ocean, water, the amount of distance from one side of the ocean to the other and all the dynamics in between are going to clearly distribute that radiation very, very widely. So I think that the notion that it just comes straight across to the West Coast isn't any more true than the wind blowing straight in a line either. So the real problem for those on the West Coast, just like the problem for people in Japan, is the radiation concentrating up the food chain over time, which is what will likely happen in the Pacific.
Excellent. I want to thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all.